Just saying.
This movie.
I don't know, guess we're about to find out. In 2011, an 8-year-old Greta Thunberg found out about climate change, and she was shocked at how little was being done about it. The news left her terribly depressed, causing her to become sick to the point of not eating, and she struggled with mental illness for years to come. When I was 9 years old, I watched the 1972 Lorax cartoon and had literal nightmares about the destruction of the environment. So we're basically the same person. I'm joking, of course, but it's not an exaggeration to say that environmental destruction is absolutely nightmare-inducing, or that the 70s cartoon did not hold back with its themes and imagery, presenting us with scenes that are downright heartbreaking. But in a way, it doesn't really matter, because when I talk about the Lorax, most people are not going to picture the 1972 cartoon, or even the original 1971 book for that matter. They are going to think of the 2012 CGI movie adaptation, and if they belong to a particularly cursed corner of the internet, they are going to think of a very specific aspect of that movie. Other attempts had been made at adapting Seuss's work for a modern movie-going audience, and it does beg the question of how do you stretch out like 3 pages worth of text and 20 minutes worth of a TV special into a feature-length film? The answer usually comes as just filling the movies with stuff, and the public reactions are kind of mixed. At its core, the Lorax story has a very simple premise that can be adapted into different narratives, namely, nature good, factory bad. It is not the only cartoon to talk about it, but it is a moral that is worth repeating, because humanity doesn't seem to be getting the memo. In theory, the 2012 movie shouldn't have much of a problem in creating a lengthier script that still preserves this message, but in practice, the short answer is that they failed, and I'm not the first person to point that out. But I also think that the things they kept the same point to a larger issue that permeates all Lorax media, and unless we address it, we will never be able to carry out the mission that the story so diligently assigns us. So hop on your wagons and follow me to Truffula Valley, because I want to talk about the Lorax. I would like to take a look at the 3 big Lorax incarnations, them being the book, the cartoon, and the movie, released in that order throughout the decades. The book starts off with a kid, representing the reader, walking through a desolate valley until he reaches the Street of the Lifted Lorax, where one can find the decaying house of a character known as the Onceler. This recluse is the only one who can reveal what happened to the Lorax, solving the mystery of why was he lifted and taken somewhere. You can get the Onceler to tell you this story by bringing him 15 cents, a nail, and the shell of a great-great-great-grandfather snail. Then he will check the money, lower a listening device, and whisper the tale to you. Long ago, before the valley was destroyed, a young Onceler arrives in his wagon in search of a specific material to make his products. He becomes fascinated by truffula trees, a plant that grows all over the area and whose soft tufts are perfect for creating thneeds, a fine something that everyone needs. He chops down a truffula and gets to work, but from the stump he left behind emerges the Lorax, a creature that claims to speak for the trees. The Lorax is furious that the Onceler is chopping down truffulas, but the Onceler tells him to calm down. After all, he only cut 1 tree, so he's doing no harm. The thneeds he makes are an immediate success, so the Onceler calls his family and starts building a factory. He upgrades his production, knitting thousands of thneeds and cutting down more trees than ever. All the while, the Lorax keeps trying to talk to him, warning him of the damage he's been causing. Thanks to his destruction of nature, the animals that once lived in the valley can no longer survive there, so one by one the Lorax sends them off. The Onceler ignores his warnings and continues to increase the size of his factory, and the Lorax still tries to talk him out of it. Eventually, the Onceler gets really mad at all the nagging and claims that he intends to keep doing what he's doing, because he is figuring on biggering. But just then, they hear the sound of the last tree in the valley being chopped down. Now that there are no more truffulas, the workers all leave, and the only things left under the bad-smelling sky are a big empty factory the Lorax, and the Onceler. The Lorax says nothing and shoots the Onceler one last glance as he lifts himself up and escapes through a hole in the smog, leaving behind a stone monument with a single word etched onto it: unless. Ever since that day, the Onceler stayed inside his old house, watching as his factory crumbles to dust, wondering what the Lorax's word could mean. But now that the kid has approached him and heard his story, he suddenly understands, and states that unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. With that, he gives the kid the last Truffula seed, and entrusts them with replanting the forest so that the Lorax and his friends may one day come back. Overall, it's a pretty neat book. It's really not a hard read, and the moral is simple enough that any kindergartner can understand, but Dr. Seuss really excels at the rhyming here, and the illustrations follow his very iconic style. He supposedly helped write the 20-minute TV special as well, which was released a year after the book was first published. The structure of the story is pretty much identical, so I'm not going to repeat the whole summary here, but the script added some extra stuff that really helps enhance the narrative. For starters, we get a better glimpse of the society that was built around the factory, with the Onceler's kin gathering in celebration of his successes and venerating him as a great thinker, remembering his humble start and rejoicing at the landmark of selling 1 millionth needs. We also get more instances of the Onceler trying to come to terms with his own guilt over destroying the valley. Like in the book, he continuously claims that he is doing no harm, but there's also a longer conversation he has with himself.
Aren't you ashamed, you old Onceler?
He asks himself, fully knowing that the things he does are, as he puts it, completely ungood. But he talks himself out of his own backlash by saying,
But if I didn't do them, then someone else would.
As for the Lorax, he also gets more scenes of speaking for the trees, trying to convince not only the Onceler but also other workers of the harm they are doing, pointing to the destruction they have caused and yelling about how fragile their valley is. Like in the book, he is also ignored, and although he does at some point get very close to making the Onceler see the error of his ways, the businessman quickly snaps out of it. We still have the same framing device, with the kid walking up to the Onceler's house and listening to the old tale, which in turn allows the Onceler to finally understand the Lorax's word and entrust the kid with the final Truffula seed. With the two iterations of the story being so similar, the TV special is relaying pretty much the same message that the book had. The Onceler represents reckless progress in the name of consumerism. He values profits above all else and is motivated by increasing the size of his market. He is the very idea of capitalism, pushing onwards despite several warnings of his environmental destruction and excusing his own guilt. The thneeds he makes represent commodities in general, basically cool stuff that we can buy. We don't need a thneed, but the Onceler's marketing strategies are pretty convincing.
Everybody need a thneed.
As for the Lorax, he is the one who speaks for the trees. You can interpret this in two slightly different ways, but the end result is the same. It is possible to see the Lorax as the literal voice of nature, speaking as the trees, and the constant warnings he gives out are nature's way of showing the Onceler that this growth pace is unsustainable. You can also picture him as a nature activist, speaking in the name of all of the creatures that live in the valley, trying to tell factory owners to maybe stop polluting so much. But no matter how hard he tries to make his voice heard, the Lorax is ruthlessly ignored. He sees destruction all around him and he is powerless to stop it. When he leaves, it's the sign that nature itself has been damaged beyond recognition. As for the kid, like we said, they represent the audience. Really, we are the ones listening to the Onceler's tale, and the seed we are given at the end is less of a literal seed and more like a call to action, a request to listen to the Lorax's pleas and undo the damage that the Onceler has done. Again, it's not a bad moral, and it's also not a very hard moral to understand. But the way this story is constructed paints a picture that is extremely disturbing. We are being told this tale in the past tense. Nature is dead, the Lorax is gone, and the disgraced figure of the Onceler is all that remains. The Lorax failed to make the Onceler see the error of his ways before it was too late, so now the man is asking the kid, as in future generations, to fix the mess he has created. But the Onceler didn't really change. You have to pay him to listen to his story. This man holds the last Truffula seed. He is apparently the only known survival of the whole debacle, and has not only the key to making things better, but also the knowledge on how they got bad in the first place and how they can be fixed. And he is making you pay him so he can help you. He is still a capitalist. It's worth noting that the TV special cut out this part, so you get to hear the story for free. But it doesn't change the fact that the Onceler was sitting on this knowledge this entire time and waited until someone else showed up instead of just trying to fix his own mess himself. The Lorax's monument is also a symbol of this issue, with unless standing for unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. The Onceler took years to understand that meaning and then reveals it to the kid. Unless someone like the audience cares, nothing is going to get better. But if we're looking for someone who cares, then the answer was in front of us all along. The Lorax did care, a whole awful lot. Except he was powerless to stop a reckless market. What we need is someone who both cares and holds the power to change things. The Lorax wasn't talking to the audience when he left those rocks behind. He was talking to the Onceler. Unless someone like the Onceler cares to change things, nothing is going to get better. But the Onceler just passes on the responsibility. You might have noticed that the Onceler doesn't have a face, being depicted as just a pair of gloves. That's because he is meant to represent a general concept. He is profit-driven environmental destruction, and that is something that can be caused by any capitalist. But when we get to the 2012 movie, we very quickly realize this anonymity is no longer the case, and this decision has more thought behind it than one might expect. The producer, Christopher Meledandri, stated that this choice came from how, the minute you make the Onceler a monster, you allow the audience to interpret that the problem is caused by somebody who is different from me, and it ceases to be a story that is about all of us. In my opinion, this was a really clever choice. We are no longer dealing with an amorphous, overpowering concept. We are talking about an individual. And this shows us that environmental destruction is largely caused by actual, very specific people, which is a much more accurate representation of the problem we have at our hands. You can see some early concept art of the Onceler looking a bit stylized, but this was probably changed to a more humanoid look once they decided the rest of the cast was also going to be human. The way I see it, this also opens up a fascinating range of possibilities, where they could have made the character look like any real-life capitalist they wanted, sending a much more poignant message. But instead, he looks like this. Just like Dr. Seuss wanted! The protagonist of the Lorax movie is played by Zac Efron. He has an actual name in this, but since they put the voice of a 25-year-old man in the body of a 12-year-old boy, I can't see him as anything other than Zac Efron.
Better say this. Yikes.
He lives in a post-Onceler world where everything is plastic and fake. The factory from the original book expanded into Needville, a city driven by consumerism. And mock this movie all you want, but I think this was a good expansion of the lore of this universe. A good expansion of the Lorax, if you will. The original Lorax story dealt with the past, in the form of the Onceler's tale, and with the future, in the request for the kid to replant the forest. Therefore, the present was left unexplored. What did it mean to live in a post-need society, or to search for the Onceler under those circumstances? This is what the movie intends to investigate. It doesn't always do a great job of developing that, but, you know, A for effort. The Zac Efron kid has a crush on this girl, and she's voiced by Taylor Swift, and she's like 5 years older than him, and it's kinda weird, but she really likes trees, so he wants to find her a tree. Except there are no real trees in this world because, as far as we can tell, nature is out of the picture. The only person who knows what happened to the trees is the Onceler, so the kid goes off to find him. The Onceler decides to tell him the story, but over the course of several days, meaning the kid has to keep visiting him. He's a little bit different than the character from the book, not only because he looks like this, but also because he's less driven by profit. His lifelong mission of making thneeds is more of a plot to get the admiration of his family than to establish a business. He also gets to share way more screen time with the Lorax, especially before finding success as a salesman, something that happened almost instantaneously in previous iterations. The Lorax initially tries really hard to get rid of the Onceler, but the two share some adventures and grow closer, and the young man promises not to harm the forest anymore, which wins the creature over. They make pancakes together and play cards, and the Onceler seems to lose interest in making thneeds. But success comes knocking at his door when he least expects it, prompting him to call his family, and they end up convincing him to betray his promise and start chopping down trees again. The Lorax tries to stop him, but the situation has grown out of control, and before he knows it, the Onceler has destroyed the valley. Like, it is absurdly fast. It takes exactly one song to do it. Yes, the song represents the passage of a longer amount of time, but the pacing is still really off. This leads us back to the present and gives us a better idea of why the Onceler has decided to tell this story in parts. One reason is to pad out the plot, because come on man, we've got 90 minutes to fill. But there's also how he seems to be testing the kid's determination. If he really were to entrust the last Truffula seed to someone, he needed to make sure the person actually cared. But the third reason was most likely out of loneliness. The Onceler just wanted someone to talk to. His character journey in the movie is less about the dangers of capitalism and more about his own lack of meaningful connections. When he turns full businessman and cuts down the trees, the audience isn't supposed to feel bad for nature as much as they're supposed to feel sad that the Lorax and the Onceler aren't friends anymore. I mean, the movie just spent 50 minutes building up their bromance. Now all he has left is a family that doesn't appreciate him and that abandon him once his factory goes down. As the Onceler is telling the story to the kid, he figures out pretty quickly that little Zach here only wants a tree to impress a girl. I guess that by the end of the movie he became a little more aware that trees are good, and he is acting in direct defiance of the capitalist authorities of his society, but he also just really wants a kiss from Taylor Swift, gosh darn it. But that's still enough to make the Onceler trust him, because this movie's not really about nature anymore. The kid gets the seed, he has a chase sequence, he plants the tree, his crush kisses him, everyone clapped, but the real happy ending comes in a later scene, where the Onceler is reunited with the Lorax after so many years. As relevant as it is though, the Onceler story is still only half the plot. The other half explores more of Needville and the corporations that rule it. This is a city that was shaped by the thneed and what the item represents, so the progression here is rather believable. It is a shallow, consumerist society, where people are happy just because they get to own cool stuff. Even their most basic needs seem to have been commodified, because now they have to pay for clean air. But I don't think they took this premise as far as it could have gone. The book and the cartoon were clearly critiquing the capitalist need for reckless growth. The Onceler established a market by convincing people they needed to buy superfluous products, and destroy the valley for the sake of his own profits. He wasn't providing anything essential to society. There is one scene in the TV special where the Lorax confronts the Onceler, telling him to shut down the factories, but the Onceler argues that this would be bad for the workers.
Well, what do you want? I should shut down my factory? Fire 100,000 workers? Is that good economics?
I see your point, but I wouldn't know the answer.
The Lorax's response has always struck me as surprisingly powerful. Here, the cartoon goes from just nature good, factory bad, to admitting that the question is oftentimes more nuanced than it seems. But we don't know enough about this universe to tell what the true consequences of shutting down the factory would be. Why do people need the jobs in the first place? The simplest answer is that the people need the job to get the money to buy thneeds. If there were no thneeds, there would be no jobs, but there also wouldn't be a reason for those jobs to exist. The Onceler essentially manufactured his own problem. But in the real world, people often need jobs for more than just buying stuff. You need a job so you can pay for basic things like shelter and water and food. Sure, we need to afford commodities, but we also need to afford basic needs that have been commodified. The cartoon doesn't talk about this side of the argument, but the movie does, because people need to pay for air. Except the movie doesn't fully go there either. You know, for a world where air is apparently so polluted you need to keep buying purified liters of the stuff just to breathe in your own house, people sure seem to spend a lot of time outside. Needville wants to present us with a world where everyone worships commodities, but it doesn't have the guts to show us what happens when people can't afford what has been commodified. There's a scene where the villain is talking to these marketing agents about the possibility of selling bottled air, but the factory that makes the bottles would make the air even more polluted, meaning that people would buy more of the purified stuff, increasing factory production and keeping the cycle alive. It's a genuinely concerning scenario, and something that has probably happened already to some extent in this universe. This villain, Aloysius O'Hare, actually got the idea to sell air after the Thneed business went bankrupt, seeing how the old factories had wrecked up the area so badly that clean air became a luxury item. This very concept is terrifying and gives the cause a lot more impact. Because people can live without needs, but they can't live without air. With O'Hare being the only source of clean air, people had no choice but to go to him, which made him powerful enough to rule the city. You might argue that his wealth came from a more righteous place than the Onceler's, since he was providing a service that people actually needed instead of just selling cool stuff, but his air factories actually make the free air worse, so he is generating scarcity for the sake of creating his own market. While the Onceler is shown to be a more redeemable, morally gray character, O'Hare is unarguably the villain. While the Onceler didn't care much for nature being destroyed, O'Hare rejoices over that possibility because it will make people more dependent of his services. He doesn't need much to convince others that he is a great thinker, and the Needville people already celebrate him much the same way the workers in the cartoon celebrated their own businessmen. I think this villain represents something a lot closer to what we have today. O'Hare is richer than anyone could imagine, and he built his fortune by taking advantage of a nasty situation. There seems to be no government in Needville, and if it exists, they're not doing anything, so O'Hare was left free to grow his business without major regulations. He gathers data on Needville citizens and uses it for his own selfish purposes, and he also suppresses evidence that what he is doing is harmful to the planet. It's cartoonishly evil, but it's also stuff that literal business owners get up to in real life. It's silly, but this movie is what made me realize that what happened to air in the Lorax verse is what happened to drinking water here. That's also where the movie stops developing the true consequences of this idea. The factory thing isn't mentioned again, and the stakes for the rest of the characters are, at worst, having things remain the way they are. I'm not saying their situation is good, because they're living in a polluted wasteland, but the Needville citizens don't seem to lack much. You don't see them struggling to get by, or having breathing problems if they step out of their houses, or even complaining about the monopoly O'Hare has over their air supply. Their biggest sin is refusing to understand where pollution ends up, which is also the problem with the Onceler. But unlike the Onceler, they don't have anyone to tell them of what's going on, or much of a choice in stopping the damage from happening. Really, Needville is fine. And that's where the comparisons with the real world are weakened, because in real life, a lot of the people are very much not fine. There's concept art that goes a little bit more in-depth concerning the mechanics of air selling, but those aspects seem to have been cut out of the final product. Because the movie is steering away from an environmental plot in favor of a story about meaningful relationships, which is its biggest defect, but also its greatest strength. The Zac Efron kid initially has selfish motives to go searching for a tree, but he later understands that he can't do this alone. The only way to replant the valley is with the help of his community, who also come to realize the intrinsic value of nature. In the end, only the power of human connections can help a kid accomplish such a daunting mission. And this mission was still assigned to him by the Onceler, because no matter how different this Onceler is from the rest, he continues to put the fate of humanity in the hands of future generations. And honestly, that's really messed up. After learning about global warming, Greta Thunberg became an environmental activist, and she gained notoriety for her speeches.
Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? They also rely on my generation sucking hundreds of billions of tons of your CO2 out of the air with technologies that barely exist.
This is super cool and inspiring and etc., but it's most of all painfully true. Older generations, specifically the members of those generations that caused the whole environmental destruction scene in the first place, love telling younger generations that it's their job to fix the mess the older ones made. And they say this with a sense of both pity and admiration, not realizing how unfair it is. The Onceler could have stopped all of this disastrous scenario from happening, and he could have tried to fix it himself after the Lorax left, but he chose not to, and still had the audacity to charge you before he told you how to fix it. And I don't know about you, but when I read the Lorax or watch the TV special, I don't feel like the audience stand-in kid. I feel like the Lorax. I feel like the little creature desperately screaming for people to stop messing up the planet, feeling absolutely ineffective in the face of destruction, knowing that what we really need is someone who not only cares, but who also has the power to stop this from happening. And then people go and tell the kids that it's their mission to fix this whole mess, as if they alone had the capacity to rebuild what we have destroyed, as if it was somehow too late for the real responsible parties to actually help. But it's not an old versus young issue. It's not the kid versus the Onceler. It's all of us. It's a whole community. After all, I believe it was one Zac Efron who said, "We're all in this together." Thank you for watching. Well, hello there. It was very nice of you to watch this video. If you have enjoyed the video, you can do those cool things such as clicking the like button, subscribing to the channel, and clicking the notification bell too. You can also follow me on Twitter and share this video with your friends. If you really like what I do, you should consider supporting me on Patreon. I have linked it down in the description and I highly recommend you check it out. Feel free to leave a comment down below, especially if it is about how much you love the Lorax. Or you can love the Onceler too, you know, I don't judge. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on my next video. Bye!